So, good morning. This is State Capitol Visits from Lumen Strategies. I appreciate everybody joining us today. For many of you, I think, are familiar with our company. Like I said, I see many familiar faces on the call this morning. We are Lumen Strategies, and we empower chambers of commerce to be the voice for business in your community. And we do that through our advocacy consulting services, as well as our signature online experience, the Advocacy Framework. I see Jessica Toller from Matthews just joined us. She is part of our Advocacy Framework program, and hopefully would be happy to talk to anybody about that if you ever have any questions. I think I'm safe in asking you to reach out to Jessica and hear from her directly about that program. I'm joined today by my teammates, Sarah Principe, who's our advocacy strategist, and Brittany Burton, who's our online learning strategist. I think many of you all have had the opportunity to meet them either virtually or in real life. I know Sarah had the opportunity to be with our folks down in Alabama late last year, and I know we've got a number of Alabama chambers on today. We'll talk a little bit about your upcoming visit through your state association as we talk about state capitol visits. And then Brittany often is following up and answering a lot of the questions you have. She kind of runs our chat during these presentations. And so if you have any questions throughout, feel free to throw those in the chat and Brittany will make sure that we address those. So today we're talking about your state capitol visit, kind of that trip that you all would take to go see your legislators in the state capitol. I will make a brief side note to say that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about would be applicable to a U.S. Capitol visit as well. And we'll try to identify as we go through some of the similarities, some of the differences that you might have. But I would say from the very beginning, let's talk about what kind of visit you're going to have when you take your chamber members to the state capitol. And I kind of give you this dichotomy on this first slide of the field trip or the work trip. And like a lot of things, it's not a true dichotomy. It's kind of a sliding scale. You can kind of incorporate elements of both of these trips into one visit. And we'll kind of talk about how that would work as we go. But first of all, let's talk about what I refer to as the field trip to the state capitol. And I use this term, and I think a lot of people might think of it somewhat negatively, like it's just kind of an elementary school type trip. And I use the word field trip because there are elements of kind of that elementary school field trip that are incorporated here. But I don't want you to think that we're saying this is something juvenile or with no value, because there really are values to this kind of trip. And first of all, one of the things with this type of trip is it might include sightseeing. And so this is one, if you are far from your state capitol, if it is not an experience that your members often have, there may be things that they want to see just because they've not been there before. Certainly, if you're taking a Washington trip and you are fairly far from Washington and your people don't get to be there very often, if they're going to make the investment to go up and spend a couple days in Washington, probably buy a plane ticket, pay for a hotel room, they're probably going to want to see the Lincoln Memorial, see the Washington Monument. And there may be the same sort of situation in your state capitol. The other thing that I would say about the sightseeing aspect is it's really going to depend on your state capitol. So with all due respect to my home state here in North Carolina and to the folks we have on the call with us today from North Carolina, the North Carolina Legislative Building is not exactly the most architecturally interesting. So there's not necessarily that sightseeing element that you might have. And I put that in contrast. I grew up in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's state capitol has a rotunda that is reminiscent of the U.S. Capitol rotunda. A lot of really intricate details in the architecture when they built that in the early 1900s. So if I were in a Pennsylvania chamber and we were going to the state capitol, we might want to set aside some time to do kind of the historical sightseeing elements of that capitol trip. Now, the other thing with kind of this field trip type state capitol visit is often you're going to do it with a bigger group. And that's just because some things are easier to facilitate when you have a bigger group. And it could be your chamber taking a big group, or it could be working with other organizations to take a big group. I know we've got a number of folks from Alabama with us today, and that in a couple of weeks, your state association has put together a great agenda for a capitol visit today. And by bringing together a lot of those different chambers, you're able to do some of the field trip type things that you might see. You're going to have the opportunity to socialize with folks from other chambers. I say if it is a pure field trip, it's probably going to be less focused on policy. But what I think Alabama has planned is kind of a hybrid model. And we're doing something similar with some of our clients here in North Carolina in about a month, where because you've got the big group, you can bring in big speakers. I believe I saw the Alabama Chamber is going to have the Speaker of the House. We're going to have the Speaker of the House for our North Carolina visit. And so by leveraging the size of your group, you can kind of get the attention of some important policymakers to come give your members firsthand information about what's happening at the Capitol. And that really kind of adds to the value of kind of that field trip thing, where you're not exactly advocating with the speaker. Perhaps you have an opportunity to ask a question or two, but you're really able to expose your members to kind of the power folks to let them hear firsthand what's happening. Now, the other type of visit is more of what we would call a work trip. So oftentimes this is going to be with a smaller group where you're going to have individual meetings with your legislative delegation or perhaps other important policymakers. You're going to go in with kind of some specific objectives, and you might have more staff interactions. So one of the things that I think when somebody's planning an initial trip, if you haven't done it before, oftentimes we want to meet with our elected officials, and that is fantastic. And you absolutely should try to meet with your elected officials when you have the opportunity. But it's also really important when you visit the state capitol that you take the opportunity to meet with their staff. Oftentimes the intricate policy questions are really being answered at the staff level. They're going to have a deeper understanding of legislation. And oftentimes from the executive side, they're going to be the ones implementing legislation. So you really want to take advantage of the opportunity to meet with those folks. Now let's talk about kind of that hybrid, like the Alabama trip, I think is a great example of kind of a hybrid event. As I looked at the agenda, you have the opportunity where everybody's coming together. You're going to hear from Lieutenant Governor, Speaker of the House, and Paige, I apologize if I'm not getting all of these exactly right, but I think I saw those folks on your agenda. You have the opportunity to hear from those who are making the decisions. And then, as I understand it, you're going to kind of spread out and everybody's going to have the opportunity for these smaller group meetings to meet with their elected officials. Now, if you are taking a big group, this is where you might have to do a little specific planning going into those meetings as to who's going to represent. Do you have the space? If you don't have the space, how are you going to handle that? Are you going to have to break your group up? And then kind of going back to a little bit of that kind of field trip, fun socializing type thing, the Alabama folks, I think, are going to a charity baseball game, charity softball game in the evening. And so a great opportunity to kind of make the full day out of that trip. So let's talk about that legislative visit. And if you are the one who is doing the scheduling for it, and that might be for the whole day, that might be just for aspects of the trip, if you're coming together with a larger group, the one thing that we kind of really emphasize for a legislative visit is being balanced, to be prepared, but also flexible. And this can be tough for Chamber of Commerce executives. I know a lot of you have a healthy amount of OCD. You like to have everything planned out perfectly. You've got probably a tight schedule. When you put together your annual meeting, you may know minute by minute what is going to happen. And it's important to understand when you go to a Capitol visit, best laid plans may be cast aside because the schedules of the folks you're meeting with or the meeting schedule for the legislature that day may shift from what you initially planned. So you want to have every detail planned, but you also want to have plan B, plan C, plan D, so that if you end up in the Capitol with your members and a meeting gets canceled, you know what you're going to do during that time. So as you start to plan the visit, it's kind of the classic journalism, who, what, when, where, why. What we say is who, where, when, and objective as your key questions. So the first question, who? And I'll just pause real briefly to say that if you think these little symbols on my slides are clever, the owl who says who. Those are compliments of my son, who is a communications major at Butler University in Indiana. He interned with me last summer, helped put together these slides. He gets all the credit for the clever icons. If you don't like them, I take full responsibility for having raised a son with a quirky sense of humor. So, who? First of all, how many people will attend? Is this going to be a small group visit? And if it's a small group visit, some things are going to look different. It's going to be easier to get in to a conference room to talk with an elected official. But if you're taking 4 or 5 people, you probably should not expect the Speaker of the House to come address your group, unless, of course, you're fortunate to have the Speaker of the House as your representative. Or if you're doing the big visit, then that's going to create some other logistical challenges, but also some other opportunities. And particularly with that big group, who's representing your coalition? So if you do have a bigger group and you're able to find the space where you can have 20 people in a meeting with a legislator, you're going to have to be a little bit more planned out as to who is going to open the meeting, who is going to speak about specific topics. Particularly, I think we all know this, there are chamber members who can hijack a meeting, and you want to be careful, if you know who they are, that they don't take the meeting down off on a tangent that maybe isn't about what the priorities are for your organization. And then finally, which officials will you meet with? And so we talk a lot about meeting with the elected officials within our delegation, but also think about other people, maybe from the administration. Let's say there's an important road project in your community that just doesn't seem to be moving. Maybe there are some folks with the Department of Transportation that you want to meet with to see what can be done to move that project ahead. Or maybe there's investment being made in broadband infrastructure in your community, and you want to meet with the IT folks who are giving out the grants for the broadband investment to make sure that they're focusing on your community. So kind of figure out who you want to meet with, in part based on who represents you, and in part based on what issues are important to you. And even at the elected official level, let's say there is a bill that your chamber is really interested in moving forward, and it's not in an area of expertise for your member. Perhaps see if your member will facilitate a meeting with the appropriate committee chair or bill sponsor for that legislation, so that you can talk to them about why it's important to your community and make the connection with your legislator that this issue is important, and with the bill sponsor that your legislator is hearing about their bill, or the committee chair that your legislator is hearing about the issues in their committee. Next, where? And so, I mean, one of the fundamentals is, where do people park? And this can be even more logistical. Like, are we going to take a van and put 10 members in a van and drive there? Or are we going to have people meet there? If you are having people meet there on their own, you know, don't just give them one place to park. Give them the preferred place to park, but also give them alternatives. This is one of those where there's a lot of kind of care that you want to do for your members, particularly if it's their first time on a legislative visit like this. There's going to be a certain amount of apprehension. They don't know where they're going. They've never sat down with a legislator for a conversation before. You want to put them at ease as much as you can. So give them, the instructions on, this is where you park. And if that parking lot's full, this is your plan B. And if that parking lot's full, this is your plan C. Because even though it's not going to be your fault if the parking lot is full, you're going to kind of get the responsibility for that if folks have those kind of difficulties. Where will the meeting be? In Washington, a lot of times meetings occur in a room where it's a slightly bigger room, but there's 4 meetings going on in different corners. It might be a hallway meeting. It's important to know what your options are, what your contingencies are. One of the things that causes me a little anxiety for the trip we're doing with our clients to Raleigh in a few months is the meeting we're in or the room where we're meeting is a committee meeting room. And if a committee meeting pops up at the last minute, we're not going to have access to that room. So we have to be prepared for an alternative. Also, it's kind of that logistical, okay, if we're not taking a van with all of our members and we have kind of control of them, where are we going to meet when we get to the Capitol? Are we going to meet outside and go through any security together? Is it, is the building easy to navigate, that if we give people a reference point inside, they'll be able to find it? Again, you just kind of want to have all of those logistics taken care of so that where is not an issue for the people that you're taking on your trip. When? So obviously things like the date and time and communicating to people and, hey, our first meeting's at 9 and from our community, it's typically a 2-hour drive to the Capitol, but please leave an extra half hour just in case there's traffic, those sort of things. That's kind of basic. Some of the things though that you, particularly if you're not doing this often, you might not be as aware of. The first is legislative calendar. And if you're going to the Capitol, let's say to make a budget request of your members, that's one of the most important things that you want to talk to them is about an item you're trying to get in the budget. Well, you certainly want to make sure that you're going early enough in their legislative session that you can impact the budget. You don't want to be waiting, in North Carolina until May when they typically have the budget basically done by that point for scheduling your meeting. If you're trying to get a bill introduced and your state has a bill introduction deadline, you want to make sure that you're getting there ahead of that introduction deadline so that the folks you're talking to have time to act on the things that you're asking them to do. The other thing you want to do is be cognizant of kind of the legislative calendar as far as what are they doing and what are the risks that your meetings are going to get canceled based on when you're scheduling them. So again, I'll use a North Carolina example. There's kind of 2 big weeks, kind of in the middle of their legislative session that I would counsel to stay away from. The first is what we call crossover week. So they have a week by which every bill has to either pass the House or pass the Senate in order to remain eligible. And during that week, legislators are often in committee meetings for hours on end, in floor sessions for hours on end, as they literally are processing dozens, if not 100 bills during that week. If you were to schedule a trip during that week, it is going to be very difficult to get time with your legislators because they're going to have other demands on their time. And then a lot of people, and historically this was the case, would think, well, we'll go up the week after crossover then, because after they have that really intense week, things will slow down and they'll have more time to meet with us. In recent years, the legislature has basically taken a spring break the week after crossover and they're not there. So you could plan to go to your Capitol. There won't be anybody in town to meet with. Now, nice for some states, they've gotten a little bit more like a federal calendar where they publish at the beginning of the year what their expectation is for when they'll be in session on a weekly basis. So certainly check to see if your state has those sort of things. And also will back up at this point for all of these things, whether it's where to park or when are they going to be in session or how do I get a room? That can feel overwhelming if this is your first time organizing a state capitol trip. And I would say, look for resources. First of all, within your chamber, do you have any companies in your chamber that have state lobbyists who can provide counsel to you on how to answer some of these questions or plan for some of these contingencies? If not, your state chamber or your state chamber of commerce executives association might be a great resource. And one of the great things about working with chambers, people are very collegial. They'd be happy to give you some of help on some of those logistical questions. So reach out to those folks. Now, finally, let's talk a little bit about your objectives for your meetings while you're in this Capitol. And one early objective is just education. So oftentimes when an issue is starting to percolate up through your members, the most important thing to do is educate your legislators about that issue. I think back probably 2-3 years ago, coming out of COVID, I think a lot of chambers started to hear about the business impacts of childcare and childcare availability. And their members were saying, hey, we're having trouble recruiting employees. We're having trouble with absenteeism because childcare is not readily available for us. At that time, I don't think many legislators had childcare on their radar, and they certainly weren't thinking about it from a business issue. So during that time, it was very important to educate legislators about the problem. It wasn't necessarily, hey, we're dumping this problem on you and we want you to solve it. It's, we want to make you aware that this is an issue that we're starting to hear about from your constituents and our members, and we wanted to make you aware of it. Now, the second objective might be action. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, I think a lot of chambers have now come down with some pretty specific policy requests around childcare that they are asking legislators to take action on. And so when you go in and have these meetings, now's the time to say, hey, this legislation has been introduced and we would love for you to co-sponsor it, or we would love, if you're on the committee that it is in, for you to vote this out of committee. And when it comes to the floor, we would love to have your support and vote for this legislation. And so that's our last bullet point on this slide, is to have that very specific ask. And so even if it's education, education can have an ask with it as well. It can be, hey, when you hear about this issue that we just discussed, when you hear other legislators talking about it, pay attention to what they're looking to do with it. Feel free to let us know what ideas are being put forward, and we hopefully can continue to come back with you as we hear some solutions so that we can work on this together. So some very specific things when you are in the meeting and how you're communicating with the folks that you're meeting with. And one of the things I always say is start and end with thank you. Even if you're meeting with a legislator who never supports anything that you ever do, I think it's good just to thank them for their service. They're with all the things with elected officials, can be a very stressful position. There can be a lot of time demands on them, demands on their personal life. They get a lot of abuse from the public, and sometimes rightfully so, but just being able to say thank you to them for their service goes a long way. And so that's why I say start the meeting with thank you. Thank you for serving. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We know that you're very busy, and we just want you to know how much we appreciate it. And then again, end that meeting with thank you. When you're talking about issues, establish the problem in two ways. One, give them some key facts, but also give them compelling stories. It's interesting. Everybody processes information differently. If you know how your legislator processes and they are more anecdote driven, give them more anecdotes. If they're more data driven, give them more data. What I love to do though is really try to tie the two together. So give them the stat of, in our county, there are 5,000 kids on the wait list for childcare. And let me tell you specifically about Sarah, who works with one of our manufacturers, and she needs childcare and can't find it. And so she actually had to quit her job. And she's got a very specialized skill set, and that's impacting the business. So create both of those. If you can, if you are at a point where a solution has been identify that solution for them. Now, that's not saying you need to go out and create one whole cloth. I think a lot of people sometimes spin their wheels because they spend a lot of time trying to solve a problem, and then they take that solution to a legislator, and the legislator says, I don't like it, we're not going to do it. But work with other people who are working on this issue, identify what is out there in the sphere of public policy, and bring that solution to your legislators. A lot of times legislators get frustrated when they feel like people are dumping their problems on them, but not having a solution. As I mentioned before, make the ask, whether it's sponsoring legislation or voting for legislation, or even just, ask them to continue to have an open mind on it, but always end the meeting telling them what you want them to do. And then lastly, I'll just say, beware of what I would call the elected entertainer. I've seen this a number of times, the legislator who really doesn't want to talk about issues. And so they get in and they just start spinning tails and trying to entertain and rubbing elbows with people. And you leave that meeting 30 minutes later and everybody feels great because they had a really fun time with the legislator, but they didn't really accomplish anything. So make sure you know what it is that you want to accomplish going in, and try not to let a entertaining legislator derail you from those conversations. Some other communication strategies, always try to keep it simple. I often think about this as a funnel. You want to know as much as you can about an issue, but then you want to funnel it down to a few key points for legislators. They are tackling so many issues, it's hard for them to retain a lot of details. So always try to really keep simple the problem and the solution as much as you can. And with that, have a very brief leave behind. I see some chambers will put together beautiful 30-page legislative agenda documents, and they are awful as an advocacy strategy because no legislator is going to be able to work their way through all that. So have the very brief leave behind with a couple few points. Find out who the key staff are to get your more detailed conversations. As I said, they're the ones oftentimes making the decisions on the nuances of legislation. End it with the one thing. I love this idea as you're closing the meeting, thank you again for your time. As I leave you, Representative Smith, the one thing I hope you'll remember from this meeting is, and give them that one thing. And then obviously send your thank you notes. And one of the things I love to do is the multiple thank you notes. So if you have their text number, an hour after the meeting, shoot them the quick text. You get back to the office the next day, shoot them the quick email. Just, hey, was really thinking about our time together as I drove home from the Capitol last night and really wanted to say thank you again. And then write them the note and put it in the mail, and then they'll get that a few days later. If you haven't gotten it from me already, I believe you can never say thank you enough. And I think the thank you note is another way to do that. So hopefully that gives you some concrete tactical things that you can do as you prepare for your visit, whether it's part of a larger visit with a big group like a state association, or whether you're planning something just for your chamber. We're happy to if you ever have any questions, just talk to you and see if we can help you with any of that. We work with chambers in a number of different ways. We can be your outsourced advocacy director. So if you're a chamber that's growing, has a few staff members, are starting to think you want to get more involved with advocacy, your members are really pushing you to be more of that 3C chamber, but you're not ready to bring somebody on full time, we can step in as kind of an outsourced resource for you and really run your advocacy program. It's kind of a lesser involvement, but another way that we can help is monitoring and reporting on your legislative priorities. So we currently do that in North and South Carolina. We're looking to expand to other states. What that looks like is we pay attention to the legislation, either that's generally affecting the business community or specifically mentioned in your legislative agenda. We monitor what's happening with that. We create a little 2 to 3 minute video, 3 to 4 minute video that you can send out to your members each week to keep them informed. It's a great way to really touch your members with advocacy on a weekly basis. And then we have our advocacy framework coaching program. So some of our chambers aren't ready to kind of make the investment in an outsourced director, but their executive wants to do more with advocacy and really wants to learn how to do that. And through our advocacy framework coaching program, we have video instructions, we have downloads, other resources, scripts that you can use. And we have twice monthly group coaching sessions. As I mentioned, Jessica Toller with Matthews is part of that program. And hopefully she would be comfortable talking to you if you ever wanted to learn more about that from somebody who's gone through it. And of course, I'm always happy to talk to you about anything with advocacy if you'd like to just find out what more you could possibly be doing. I believe Brittany is putting some links in the chat with one to a directory of all of our webinars if you want to go back and see some of the other things we've talked about. Another one with a meeting calendar request for me. I think it's for a 30-minute meeting. Don't feel obligated to spend 30 minutes with me. I know that can be a big chunk of time for a busy chamber director. If you just want to hop on call for 5 or 10 minutes, use that link, schedule some time with me. Would love to talk to you about all things advocacy.